I gave a sermon, and a lot of the thing I was talking about in the sermon, at least the first part of my sermon, was about things I was thinking about, not usually in the daytime, it was more at nighttime when it got quiet, and I'd be looking at the news and seeing what was happening, and I shared that the big emotion that was going through me was, who was going to hide us? And what felt really different this time was the number of phone calls I began getting about people's reaction to that question of who will hide us. I found that people were starting to share it before they had conversations with teachers or friends. They would say, please just listen to this part because this is how I'm feeling. I'm scared and I'm wondering who's going to hide us. And I'm not saying that emotion is not coming up. It is definitely coming up. But the more I've thought about it over the past few weeks, I realize that it is the absolute wrong question to be asking. Who will hide us? Because when I think about that question of what is that frame, where is it coming from, and why am I asking it, why are we asking it, is because when you say who will hide us, it suddenly takes us back to this moment of Anne Frank and other Jews that had not gotten out of Germany, hadn't gotten out of Austria, hadn't gotten out of the Netherlands in times where society had completely flipped. And the very last resort we had at that point when society was completely crumbled was finding non-Jews who would hide us. While we waited for this raging storm of anti-Semitism to finally come to pass. And we waited, and some survived in their hiding, and Frank did not. And eventually the skies, they cleared, and we left our cellars to see what destruction was left in its path, and we got out from the storm in September of 1945. And a lot of Judaism since that moment, since that month, on September 2nd, we almost moved to a place where Judaism got stuck in time right there. And it's understandable. Because if we think about the 1940s, it is arguably the worst thing to happen in all of Judaism. And we spoke about Egypt tonight. We have a lot of bad things. That is I would argue, the worst of the worst. And then 3 years later, we have one of the highest points in all of Judaism with the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. And in many respects, it's one of the highest moments that we go through. And when you go to these two polarities at the same time, it makes you convulse and shake, and you just freeze in time. Judaism, it's always been a religion of asking questions. Why? But after Auschwitz, it is really hard to ask why. So you stop, and we freeze. And we, as a community, we move to this place of just maintaining Judaism. Think about a lot of the organizations we've developed since the 1950s. The surveys that we do to quantify if we are surviving. The community surveys. Always checking, are we maintaining, are we surviving? And our community studies, they are just that. It becomes this obsession with survival. It's not necessarily an obsession with Judaism as a methodology to understand our place in the universe. Rabbi Emil Fackenheim, he was a Reform rabbi, he came up with this term called the 614th commandment. We have 613, he comes with the 614th, which says that we must continue Jewish life for the purpose of denying Hitler a posthumous victory. And then we coined the term, never again. And we poured millions of dollars into Holocaust museums to educate and to make sure people knew the story so that it would not happen again. And I think for a lot of us, we carry this generational trauma with us And while we may have walked in the world with confidence on October 6th, when we saw October 7th, the entire Jewish world awakened as if it was September 1945. And instantly, we said what Hamas had done was the most killing of Jews in a single day since the Holocaust. We didn't talk about the constant bombings in Israel, the rockets, the bus bombings, the plane hijackings, Olympians being murdered because they were just Jewish. We woke up just like Rip Van Winkle, and we saw the world with eyes as if it was 1945. And then as October 8th arrived, we looked around and we saw anti-Semitism roar to life in a more public way than any of us had seen in our lifetimes. Before Israel had done any retaliation for the murder of 1,400 of its citizens, there was a mob chanting, "Gas the Jews," in front of the Sydney Opera House. College students across the country, they were hiding in their dorm rooms, fearing for their physical safety. At my high school, at my alma mater down in the peninsula, at Woodside High School, a swastika was drawn outside of a Jewish teacher's classroom. And then the principal, after doing an investigation, came out and said, quote, that it was our mutual investigation was able to confirm that it was a spiritual symbol from Japanese Buddhism. Apparently, it wasn't a swastika. At a school a few blocks from here, it was reported that students were found giving Heil Hitler salutes. Swastikas were drawn on the campus of Berkeley. A Jewish student was physically assaulted. And I don't want to talk about Israel and Hamas or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I want to look at where we as Jews stand in America today. A swastika has nothing to do with Israel. Heil Hitler signs have nothing to do with Israel. Chanting "Gas the Jews" has nothing to do with Israel. I want to talk about anti-Semitism and how we should think about it in 2023. And anti-Semitism, it's real. According to the FBI, their statistics show that even though Jews are just over 2% of the population, we receive over half of the hate in America. 5 times more than that level that Muslims do. And the only reason that I'm pointing to Islamophobia part is because I'm tired of the many conversations that I'm in where this equivalency is being made. Now, to be clear, I and the entire Jewish community, we stand opposed to Islamophobia. But when I've been in conversations with members of Congress, and I talk about the increase in anti-Semitism, I've been retorted in the middle of my sentences with Islamophobia as an equivalency. There's not an equivalency right now. And even since 9/11, there's not been an equivalency if you look at the data. There's a reason why we have such high security costs at Jewish institutions. When you go to mosques and churches, you don't see the same security as you do here, because the threat is not the same. There were no marches on college campuses or in London or in New York or in San Francisco when 500,000 Syrian civilians were killed by Assad. There were no marches or protests when 100,000 civilians were killed in Yemen, including airstrikes by the Saudis on schools and hospitals and even wedding parties. There were no marches just in the past few days when nearly 1,000 people from the Masalat tribe were murdered in Darfur, Sudan because of their ethnicity by jihadists. It's not complicated. This is anti-Semitism. Our reaction inside of us is to ask the question, who will hide us? as if we're seeing the eyes from 1945. But the problem with that is that if we stand and we see the world and we act as if it is 1945, we are in big, big trouble. We see it in this week's Parsha, in Vayetze. Jacob, he flees his family where there is deceit and there's lying. He's hoping to hide and to blend in to a new area. And not shockingly, he finds the exact same situation, where instead of Jacob and his mother lying to his father, we now find Jacob being lied to by his father-in-law. The Torah, it does this again and again, and it pounds the story into our head, showing us that if you repeat your patterns in each generation, it will happen again and again, unless you do something radical to stop the pattern. Cain is jealous of Abel. Jacob is jealous of Esau. Joseph's brothers are jealous of him. The psychological term is repetition compulsion, the unconscious tendency of a person to repeat a traumatic event or its circumstances. And every single time that I read this part of the Torah, I want to yell at the page, seeing these characters repeat the same pattern over and over again, as if they have no agency. And the rabbis, they love agency. They love cycle breakers. It's why on Friday night, when you lay your hands on your children's heads, we do not say, "May you be like Jacob. May you be like Joseph." We don't say that. We put our hands on our kids' heads and we say, "May you be like Ephraim and Manasseh." Because those are Joseph's sons. And those are the first two siblings in the entire Torah to finally break the cycle and to get along. This is not 1945. I found what Sam Harris said to strike a nerve, that this is Kristallnacht, 1938, Germany. A member of our community's ice cream shop was targeted because she was Jewish. She was Jewish, and the windows of her shop were smashed. All of the surrounding stores around her ice cream shop were left alone. Hers were smashed and spray painted. Now, when we see the world through the eyes of the 1930s versus the 1940s, we are in a different part of the story. The question, it should not be who will hide us. Because if we are asking that question, it's too late. Society as we know it at that point has completely collapsed. There is nowhere to go but into hiding. So even though we may feel that, we must not have repetition compulsion. We must ask a much different question of those non-Jewish allies that we have in the community. The question we must ask is, will you fight with us? Will you fight against anti-Semitism? Will you fight against leaders who are not outraged by swastikas and Heil Hitler symbols? The question that we are asking, it's not just a Jewish question, it's an American question. It's why on this bima, that American flag right there is taller than the Israeli flag over there, because we are Americans. And America is supposed to be a place that stands against hate. America is supposed to be a place with moral clarity, where all lives are created equal. And then when that is not the case, it's incumbent upon us to rise and to link arms with those to break this cycle. To break the cycle, what we need to do is to call 5 of your non-Jewish friends and ask them if they will stand with you and if they'll stand for you against anti-Semitism, regardless of how they feel about Israel, because that's not what you're calling about. You're calling because this is not about Israel. This is about anti-Semitism and what it means to be an American. And that friend, if they're willing to stand with you, and if they say yes, that they're willing to stand against anti-Semitism, ask them to call 3 friends and see if those friends will stand with them. And then you take your allies and you take them to the heads of your schools, to your principals, to your teachers, to your workplaces, into your neighborhoods, and you fight against anti-Semitism for America. Because that is synonymous. We are not a generation that should hide. Because if you hide, you have no voice. It's incumbent upon us not to repeat the patterns of the generations that came before us, but to be different. My blessing for all of us is that we may be like Ephraim and Manasseh. Can you hear out sound?